As Commander players, there's plenty of times where we're playing a game and no matter how many test hands you run through, how much gas you put in your deck, or how low your curve possibly can be, Commander games will always go much longer than we probably planned for. As an aggro player myself, I often find myself brewing decks that play faster, hit harder, and pop off more consistently. However, there's only so much consistency I can truly achieve when all I get to work with is a concept and some test hands. When I actually get into real games, my decks that present turn 5 or 4 winning board states on Moxfield never seem to work out that fast in real games. This of course is completely normal and should be unsurprising. When you're playing against yourself, obviously you're going to get there much faster than normal. There are some games where I get the perfect hand and little to no interaction gets thrown around and my deck does reach that optimal turn window. But in most cases, the deck would and should be stopped. So if this is the case, what do I do to counteract this inevitable 2 turns added to my normal pace? And how do I find ways to rebuild a winning board state even after getting stopped completely? I like to use this simple mantra. No matter what power level, a deck needs to be able to grind. If you guys are enjoying this content, please feel free to like and subscribe and check out my Patreon in the description below, where you can get access to an extra video every single week. I can review decks that you make and you can suggest a video for this channel itself. I hope to see you guys there. In my most recent Commander builds, I've started adding cards to them that are able to help me continue advancing even when a game stalls out. If you're like me, you play in pods of all different power levels and tiers. The pods I regularly play in have a ton of interaction flying around, so getting slowed down or outright stopped is pretty normal. In pods where there is much less interaction, while it is easier to get a good game plan going, you often become a target when popping off quickly. Either way, I've been adding cards that can help me slow the game to a pace I'll have more control over. Finding ways to tap down my opponent's creatures, finding ways to gain life over time, finding some stacks pieces that don't affect me nearly as much as they do other players, and of course adding a lot of removal to my deck. There are plenty of other ways that you can find to grind in Commander, but these are the few that I've really been focusing on lately. In the past, I've advocated for players to use more removal and interaction to help make their decks more consistent, and while this is solid advice, I think the next step is to add more grind pieces to the deck in addition to the removal you're adding. With all this being said, let's go into different kinds of grind engines and when I like to use them. Now, since I am an aggro player, effects like Blind Obedience are second to none. In aggressive strategies based around combat, limiting your opponents by having their creatures intertapped allows you to go unblocked for an entire turn rotation. It also makes sure that your creatures are performing at their best while theirs are performing at their worst. Blind Obedience helps us twice over for grinding from its extort ability, giving us access to incremental life gain on top of just being tapped out. Urbrass gives us essentially 2 turns unblocked due to the fact that it enables haste in our creatures as well. And things like Thalia are not only with creatures but also non-basic lands, which helps out in terms of amount of mana available to us versus our opponents. And it also puts us in a great position against more powerful decks. In aggro decks where creature combat is inevitable, finding ways to tip the scales even a little bit with cards like these are tremendous additions to our Commander deck. I put Blind Obedience into 3 different decks recently, and it has been an absolute masterpiece in all of them. Anytime I get it, I just feel like I'm in more control over the game, and having to force my opponents to remove it always feels great and always feels worth it for me. Another thing I mentioned was life gain. It's another great way to grind out games. These types of cards allows us to slowly or even quickly recoup our life totals that are being chipped down through either burn, combat, or drain effects. Unless you're facing a combo deck that wins on the spot, incremental life gain will never be a dead card in your deck. You'll find that gaining life over time allows you to keep a relatively healthy life total so that when we get into the turn 8s and 9s and even 10s where people are swinging out with maybe 20 plus power, you're still in a good spot because you've been able to maintain a pretty decent life total throughout the whole game. Cards like Cryptgas, while being a great extort engine, also doubles your mana. Authority of the Consoles is like Blind Obedience's cousin. And Aetherflux Reservoir, while being a potential combo piece, can also gain us both a ton of life and deal with a player that might not be able to be dealt with otherwise. Aetherflux is great, especially now that I've been more of a spell slinger player and have been falling in love with that kind of archetype, the fact I also get to gain a bunch of life on top of that is great. And if it ever comes down to the 1v1, I know that I can take the game immediately. You'll find that most grind engines that we talk about in this video and that we have already talked about in this video turn out to be multifaceted. Our creature tappers do more than just tap creatures. Our life gain engines do more than just gain us life. If you find a card that has only one function or purpose for grinding, you should really make sure it's worth the mana and can stick around long enough for it to be effective. Think about something like an Essence Warden or a Johnny's Welcome. While yes, this is great for 1 mana, a card like Suture Priest is 1 more mana, but gets you some life drain as well. And if you have the colors, something like an Ellis Ilcore is an also great addition. Otherwise, if it only performs one function, make sure that it's worth the mana and can stick around long enough for it to be effective. Another way that can help you grind out some games are taxing effects. Taxing effects are some of the best ways to get around aggressive decks that you might face. As an aggro player myself, I'm often worried about keeping up mana on my opponent's turns in order to protect my board state. Combine holding mana up for that reason while also only having a limited amount of mana available, and it's going to be really hard to convince me to attack you when you have one of these effects out. Taxing effects can make a game either really slow when the taxes are paid, or extremely in your favor when they aren't paid. Cards like Ghostly Prison and Propaganda stop players from coming after you, or having a piece of removal that is hard to come by against an effect that's not really affecting the rest of the table. Cards like Rhystic Study allow you to get a ton of card advantage over the long run and helps you grind out games super effectively. And of course, cards like Smothering Tithe are almost impossible to pay consistently, allowing you to get a ton of mana over time in such a mana hungry format. Another not so talked about taxing effect is something like a Dictate of Erebos. While not being a direct tax that you have control over paying, it is an indirect stacks piece that forces your opponents into other forms of removal or having to find ways to get rid of the enchantment itself. This kind of gameplay is essentially a tax in card advantage itself, very similar to a Rhystic Study. It forces more cards out of your opponent's hands or off the board in order to deal with it. Taxing effects can prove to be some of the most oppressive grind engines that you can add into your deck and see lots of success with. Also combining these things with other life gain effects. Having something like a Ghostly Prison and a Blind Obedience out at the same time will be extremely oppressive. Not only are you going to be gaining life through extort costs, but also it's going to be really hard to chip at your life total in the first place because of the Ghostly Prison and creatures entering tapped effects. Now finally, generic stacks and removal are also great ways to keep a game going and keep it in your favor. I've talked about removal in the past, and I think the best combination of grind pieces to removal is around 16 to 20 cards total in your deck. This is quite a big number, and I totally understand that. You can definitely go down to something like 12 cards. Just know that sometimes that's not going to be super great in your favor. Now, of course, if you're going to run less than 16, make sure that you have tons of card draw in order to back it up, so you can find those pieces more consistently. I would say have about 75% of this being hard removal and about 25% being grind pieces. Grind pieces are great, but unless you're trying to really stall out a game a long time, you really only need a couple in your deck to make their use effective enough. You still want to have plenty of gas so that you can do your thing, and then every once in a while, in every other game or so, you're going to find one of these grind pieces and it's going to help you tremendously. Now, you should always look at the context of your deck itself before adding these things too. How fast am I looking to go? How consistent is my game plan? If I do get stopped, how can I recover? And what is my biggest fear in this deck? Is it being aggroed out? Is it being slowly chipped away at through burn? What is it? What is my biggest fear and how do I lose the most consistently? And what kind of grind engine can I add to my deck in order to stop that from happening? Building decks with a worst case scenario in mind can help you understand how it can grind best and what pieces you'll need to add to it in order to outlast opponents. In EDH, things can and will go wrong, so don't run from the grind, embrace it, and happy deck building. Thank you all so much for watching. If you guys enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe, and comment down below what your favorite grind piece is. I'd like to take a moment to thank my patrons. Thank you to Philly123, Chris Smith, Son of Zygote, Ruby Storm, Raphael DDL, Hayeo, Justin, Peachy Star, Zedok, Aaron Fisher, and Abrax. Your continued support means so much to me. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you guys all next time.